You don't want to do it. And oh, you don't want that. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then there's not enough gas in the system. Okay. Plenty of gas. But they just what I really don't know. So it's close to the sun.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the UT Energy Institute and the LBJ School of Public Affairs, I'd like to welcome everybody on the live stream today to the UT Energy Week Environment, Energy, and Sustainability Kickoff event. We'll start in just a few moments.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. So I'm Kerry King. I'm the Assistant Director and Research Scientist at the Energy Institute here at the University of Texas at Austin. So welcome to what turns out to be our inaugural talk, opening keynote talk here for Energy Week 2022. This is the 7th year of University of Texas Energy Week conference. So thanks for attending online and in person. Over the past 7 years, UT Energy Week has been a collective effort at the Energy Institute. Several colleges across campus, the School of Engineering, Business Law, and Public Policy. So here we are in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. So I'd like to thank the students here today, the Environment, Energy, and Sustainability Student Group here for arranging this talk and helping us at this event here, and the events after the talk today with Michael Weber. I'd just like to point out a few things that will occur the following days here as a part of Energy Week. So tomorrow we have a series of talks on fueling the sustainable energy transition, which was a seeded research effort for 11 projects amongst people on campus studying things from carbon capture and storage to grid resilience to carbon storage and biomass, trees and within Texas. Tomorrow will also be an in-person event. Bruce Niemeyer, who's the Vice President at Chevron for Strategy and Sustainability, is going to give a talk at 12:30 for our normal energy symposium series. He's going to give a talk on the future of energy, so that'll be in person. So if you're interested, you can come ask questions to a VP from one of the oil and gas majors. March 2nd, Wednesday, will be a full day of panel talks, all remote. You can find these links here on the website, energyweek.utexas.edu. The talks will range from hydrogen to carbon capture and storage to industrial sector decarbonization, innovation, ecosystem in Austin, critical minerals. So we're covering a broad range of topics in the policy and technological space in the realm of energy. And then March 3rd, no formal, not as many formal speaking events, but the university will be essentially announcing its completion of the Gary L. Thomas Engineering Energy Building. So this is the newest building on campus that is a building that has energy in its name now. So we like to claim to the Energy University and now energy building. So that's good progress for us. And so that unveiling will happen tomorrow, as long as a panel discussion led by the director of the Energy Institute, Brian Corda, in that building on sort of the future of energy. And so that is the announcements of Energy Week in general. But today it's my pleasure to announce the keynote talk here from Michael Weber. He's going to talk to us about some research that he and his group have done on decarbonizing Texas. So what does it take to make Texas as a state net zero? So in case you aren't aware, let's give a brief background on Dr. Weber. He's the Josie Centennial Professor in Energy Resources here at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also CTO of Energy Impact Partners, which is a $2 billion clean tech venture firm. over the last few years before coming back here to UT. Well, he was never fully gone. He was on sabbatical for 3 years with MG in Europe, the power and gas companies in Europe, where he acted as the chief technology officer as well. He's also written a couple of major books, Power Trip and the first Energy and Water Nexus. So I've worked with Michael a bit in the past, and now he's a great team. And so we're going to hear from some of the most recent work of his great team now again. So let's welcome Michael Weber for a start. Slogans from Texas, don't mess with Texas.
Exactly.
Right.
Thanks, Gary.
And we'll hold
Appreciate
questions to the end, by the way. So we'll hold the questions to the end.
it. Carrie and I are longtime friends and collaborators, so it's good to be here today, and I appreciate the introduction. So I've been talking about a study called Don't Mess with Texas, getting the Lone Star State to net zero by 2050, which is a collective team effort. I'll introduce the full team later, but the lead author, Dr. Isabella G, is here. So if I have any hard questions, I'll point to Isabella so she can answer them precisely, whereas the answers I give might or might not be correct. And this is essentially around the question of whether we can get Texas to net zero emissions by 2050, and if so, how might we do it? What might the trade-offs be economically and environmentally? I mean, the short story is there are many ways to net zero in Texas, and those pathways are economically beneficial for the state, and grid reliability does not decline. In fact, it might improve, and air pollution will decrease a lot. And it doesn't eliminate the oil and gas sector, which is one of the questions. If we go to net zero, does that mean oil and gas dies? We will build some new industries, especially around energy storage, carbon management, and hydrocarbon. In fact, in hydrogen, I would suggest to you perhaps the hydrocarbon industry will become the hydrogen and carbon industry. So this is kind of on my mind. It's like, oh, for Texas, oil and gas industry is very relevant. And how do we get to net zero in a way that has sort of labor harmony, where we don't completely displace every person in every sector? And it turns out we can find a lot of ways in net zero that fit in with the special skill sets and capabilities in Texas. So I think it's really a good news story. I'm happy to sort of give you a sneak peek on some of the results. They'll be released officially sometime next month. So this is sort of a preview, so to speak, of our analysis. A couple other points. Texas has a lot to lose from global warming, so I think we're particularly at risk as a state. We are at risk of more frequent and intense droughts and floods and heat waves and ice storms, as we've had in the last couple of years, rising sea levels with a long coastline, saltwater intrusion and freshwater aquifers. So we have a lot to lose from inaction on climate change, but I would say also a lot to gain from decarbonization, and that's what we'll show you with this study. We also have a lot to lose by ignoring environmental considerations of energy in general. There are already major international customers refusing energy exports from Texas because of the perception that it's not environmentally sensitive enough, especially if it's connected to fracking, which is much more controversial in Europe than it is in Texas. And there's even like French oil company Total leaving the US oil lobby because of their differences in environmental priorities, especially around climate change. And there are other places around the world competing with Texas to be the low carbon hub of the future. Rotterdam comes to mind, the UK, Norway, Los Angeles, Singapore, the Middle East, you name it. Right now we think of Texas and we think of Houston as the energy capital of the world. But Houston took that energy capital leadership from Tulsa. Tulsa had been the energy capital of the world. We might ask ourselves, well, how did Tulsa lose it and Houston gained it? Is Houston at risk of losing it also? And what do we need to do to make sure Houston and Texas remain sort of the leaders of the world when it comes to energy as the world moves to a decarbonized future? And there are other specific examples of this. If we believe these scenarios in the future oil demand, some scenarios suggest that oil demand will peak, is peaking now or peaking in the next decade. It will decline, and if our fate in Texas is tied to the fate of oil, will that be bad for our economy? Or how do we get ahead of that curve if it's going to happen? And there are some scenarios, of course, that show that oil consumption will keep growing as far as the eye can see. We don't really know which one is correct, but we know that these scenarios with peak oil consumption or peak oil demand are on people's minds. So we got a lot to lose if we get left behind in this transition. We also are uniquely situated to be a leader on this globally. We have a lot of energy that we produce and we consume. We're number one in the United States for energy production and consumption. We're a big producer of energy intensive chemicals and metals and things that make a lot of value from energy, that we take the value of energy into higher value products, that kind of thing. We also have a lot of agriculture. We have a lot of environmental impact we have to worry about. So we're a big polluter as well as a big producer. We have a lot of renewable potential in Texas, especially wind and solar. We don't have so much hydro. We have a little bit of geothermal, a little bit of bio. And we have our own electric grid, Ercot, which is, for better or worse, the situation we have now, which has its risks, but also means we can experiment with policies and integrating new technologies in a way that might be more difficult for other states. So this is a pretty exciting set of ingredients, which is we know energy. We already make money from energy. We have risks from energy, but we maybe know how to manage it better. So we're positioned much better than some other states to really lead on this, which is, I think, a great opportunity, a great fundamental starting point for us. So how can Texas reach net zero by 2050? And the answer is, well, there's a lot of ways. But to figure it out, we put together a big team to look at this. We had a 2-year plus study. I think we're on month 27 now. I'm trying to do the math exactly. So it's about a 2-year study sponsored by the Katina Foundation, the Meadows Foundation, the Mitchell Foundation, the Energy Foundation, done in collaboration at UT with CU Boulder, the business school, and also Vibrant Clean Energy, doing different modeling. We'll talk about that in a bit. So it's a big team of people that did this for quite a while to figure out how we might do this. In particular, we found 4 pathways that we thought would be really interesting to sort of flesh out the different ways we might get to net zero. In fact, there are infinite ways to net zero. These are the 4 we looked at. We looked at a scenario that really prioritized electrification, using electricity to replace heat wherever you can. A scenario that was also electrification, but accelerated so that we get to net zero on a different pathway, which means in particular getting the power sector to zero emissions by 2035. So accelerated the adoption of clean power in the power sector and electrified the other sectors. A scenario that prioritizes hydrogen and hydrogen carriers, those carriers like ammonia or formic acid or methanol or even methane in some cases. And then a scenario where we don't really change anything about the way we do the economy, but we add a bunch of carbon capture after the fact to clean it up. So this is kind of a make a mess and clean it up approach if people are worried about shutting down certain types of energy activities early. So those are kind of the 4 scenarios we looked at in greater detail to map out the envelope or range of actions. And we're looking for common policies across these different trajectories to see, well, which priority should we have? Because if there's certain policies that show up in every scenario, that's probably a good place to invest some policy effort to move things along a little faster. And on the policy topic, we examine different policy levers, but try to avoid mandates in our analysis. Although we did mandate for our analysis that we get to net zero by 2050, we didn't dictate what technology or fuel will be chosen. We use these policy levers to drive efficiency or things like that in this curve of decarbonization. But then we did an economic analysis within that to find the least cost solution within the constraints of what we need for society to get to net zero. So we ultimately were doing an economic analysis with these different priorities, which way would be cheapest to get there within those policy levers. So sort of a policy study based on some engineering analysis. These scenarios, like I say, are not predictive. We're not predicting this is the pathway we'll get to net zero. We do think net zero is possible, and we encourage us to do it because it looks really good. We'll show you those results in a second. These scenarios are illustrative of the different ranges of things we can do. And I've got the scenarios across the top. BAU is business as usual. Like if nothing intervenes from a policy perspective, what happens? And then if we have policy levers that encourage electrification or sort of decarbonization of the power sector by 2035, or going to hydrogen or capture, those scenarios are shown there. There are a couple different sort of parts of the different sectors we would ramp up or down. We looked at electric vehicles for light duty vehicles, and the electrification scenario, we did electric heavy duty vehicles. We prioritize hydrogen for light duty vehicles in the hydrogen scenario instead of electricity, this kind of thing. So we have a bunch of assumptions, but the truth is we had energy efficiency in every scenario, and we had some form of electrification in every scenario. We just sort of varied how much of that we would have in them. And there's a range of sort of factors we consider to mind. And it's too detailed and small to see on the screen, but you'll see it in the report when it comes out. I'm happy to talk about them more. We use a combination of modeling platforms and techniques to do the analysis. We started with Energy Innovation, one of our collaborators, who have an energy policy simulator, EPS, that was adapted specifically to Texas that helped us do sector-wide or statewide and economy-wide energy estimates of what we would need to run the economy. So we estimated based on this in different policies and what would happen if we did energy efficiency on a wide scale, how much energy do we need as a society, and when do we need it? Like what are the load curves for electricity, for example? And that also gave us an estimate on emissions. And we tried to use this to drive emissions as close to zero as we could, but we couldn't get all the way there. But it did give us sort of our scope for energy demand, which we plug into the wisdom model with Vibrant Clean Energy Consulting Group. And that helped us figure out with the least cost estimate what the power sector would have to do, what kind of power plants we built on the least cost model, what kind of hydrogen we would make, what pathway we use to make the hydrogen, how much hydrogen we would have to make, and then how will we manage the carbon to get us to zero emissions or on a net basis, net zero. So the policy simulator gets us close to zero, wisdom takes us all the way to zero. And then we plugged all that information, both those models into REMI, which gave us our economic impacts to look at jobs and other things. So we had like CapEx and OpEx estimates, as well as some cash flow estimates from EPS and the Vibrant Clean Energy model that we plugged into REMI. So on the left, using EPS, we drive the emissions down to zero as close as we can. Then we use wisdom to figure out the exact details, because we can't operate on an annual basis. We have to operate on an hourly basis or even less to make sure we have the energy available when we need it, so the grid doesn't collapse or so the economy doesn't have to stop. And then we can figure out what the shifts are in jobs and everything else. So it's a pretty detailed, extensive study. And we did our economic analysis, by the way, on 10 regions based on 12 economic regions of Texas. We ended up combining 2 of the western regions and 2 of the eastern regions. Texas already has analysis based on these economic regions. So we did that as well, because you can imagine that if we shut down coal plants in East Texas, but we'll build wind farms in West Texas, you might have just as many jobs, but the jobs might be in different locations. And that would be relevant information. There's a geographic specificity to energy that matters as much as the temporal specificity. We had to figure out the where of energy as much as we had to figure out the when of energy as much as like the how much of energy. So that was all part of our detailed analysis. And this is sort of the takeaway, although I still have another like 33 slides, but this is the main takeaway. For the 5 scenarios, future energy scenarios we looked at, business as usual, electrification, the advanced clean power version, hydrogen and hydrogen carriers, and extensive carbon capture, there are a bunch of trade-offs. And if we look at the economy-wide carbon dioxide equivalent emissions at the top, the business as usual scenario has a lot of emissions. And so that gets a red stoplight because that is not good for the emissions. But the net zero scenarios, we forced it by design to get to 0. So those are green or good. The CO2 equivalent emissions drop from that. Yeah, we looked at criteria pollutant emissions from the power sector, and that is also a good news story for the decarbonization sector because you're shutting down coal and when you're using less gas, you have less combustion, less emissions of the criteria pollutants. That gets better. Business as usual, you still have a lot of the air pollution, so that's not a good news story. If you look at the economy-wide energy efficiency, which is how much energy you need in total to make your economy grow and work, a couple of the scenarios are quite good. Electrification goes hand in hand with efficiency. I'll show you that momentarily. And then for the hydrogen economy, it needs more energy to make the hydrogen. So it's a little bit like business as usual. And the carbon capture approach is much more energy intensive because you build a lot of energy systems just to power the carbon capture. That doesn't mean we don't have carbon capture in the other scenarios, by the way. This carbon capture scenario just means we have a lot more carbon capture. So that's a trade-off. All of them see the economy growing. Although I'll show you the business as usual has the least economic benefits of all the scenarios. The net zero scenarios are more economically beneficial. They all grow. They grow primarily because of demographics of more people and more investment. They also all create jobs, but the business as usual and electrification jobs, job growth is more mild, but the hydrogen and carbon capture scenarios have a lot of job growth, pretty like hundreds of thousands of millions of jobs. It's very exciting. And then we can look at water use and land use, but in comparison to business as usual, and the electrification scenario and carbon capture actually avoid a lot of water use from what we build. Hydrogen is kind of a push on water because we use water as a feedstock to make hydrogen in our analysis. And then land use is one of the trade-offs. We'll use more land for renewables because they're more diffuse, although that land use could be dual use. You can do wind and solar plus agriculture and livestock and buildings and that kind of thing. The carbon capture scenario is very land intensive. So you can look at this and kind of look all, none of the scenarios are perfect. None of them are all bad, but some are better than others. And I would suggest that the middle 3 are probably preferential in terms of trade-offs, in terms of environmental impact and economic benefits, especially if you look at job creation. You might even say hydrogen is a good way for us to go to Texas, especially because that leverages so much of what we do in oil and gas. So that's kind of the takeaway. This is the most important slide, I would say. Now, the top 10 takeaways, I have 5 on this slide and 5 on the next, are that decarbonizing by 2050 is cheaper than doing nothing, and it's likely a job creator. This is a good economic story. And this is important because a lot of people say, well, I don't want to decarbonize because it will hurt the economy and kill jobs. And our analysis proves that's not true. And frankly, environmental analysis has been saying that for 50 years. So it's not really a surprise that when you clean up the environment, it creates new jobs from the scrubbers or whatever it is we use to clean up the environment. So consistent with what the literature has said for 50 years, cleaning up the environment is an economy grower and a job creator. Also, green hydrogen can help spur economic growth while decarbonizing hard to abate sectors. Hard to abate sectors are things like the chemicals industry, the metals industry, the cement industry, aviation, marine shipping, things that are harder to electrify. And then we can use hydrogen to get those hard to reach sectors. The industrial sector presents a large opportunity for emission reductions, but it's also the most difficult. It's kind of following on theme from the second point. Clean electricity is really a key enabler of decarbonization because you can flexibly power other sectors like transportation and drive statewide energy efficiency because electrification and efficiency go hand in hand, and reduce greenhouse gases and reduce criteria pollutant emissions from the smokestacks that aren't operating the same way in 2050 as they might be today. So it has all sorts of public health benefits. And then if you look at the narrative of what do we have to do between now and 2050 to decarbonize Texas, there are several big winners. Wind, solar, and storage are big winners. And by the way, the markets have already said that. We've known that for years, and we affirm that with our analysis. that really dominates the clean energy narrative. But natural gas still plays a critical role. Natural gas doesn't go to zero. And by the way, oil production, refining, exports continue in our analysis. Texas is still a major oil and gas producer, but for export. We don't burn it here because we have cheaper, cleaner ways to make energy on site. We really prioritize the exports. And this is assuming that there's an export market for oil, which might not be true if the chart I showed you 10 slides ago is really coming to fruition, which is the IEA says peak demand for oil. So we're assuming that there's still demand for oil out there in the market, and Texas will export. If we quit exporting oil, maybe we quit producing as much of it. Other takeaways. Things like efficiency standards and Clean Up Your Act policies and electric vehicles are really effective, low-hanging fruit with low barriers to entry that make a big difference, and they show up in every scenario as a cost-effective way to get going. Carbon removal technologies like direct air capture systems are important for getting all the way to zero. It's hard to get to zero. There's still some emissions from the natural gas or from the refineries and that kind of thing. So we use direct air capture to take away the carbon, to do carbon removal from the atmosphere after the fact, so to speak, especially for those hardest to abate emissions from different sectors. And by the way, going net zero provides opportunities to improve energy system resilience, partly from diversification of the energy source we use, but also because it will include a lot of storage and a lot of flexible industrial demand. Demand response is one of the most important resilience mechanisms we have that we underutilize so much in Texas, but over the next 30 years, we could build a lot of that to get to zero, which is really great. And then there are a lot of environmental co-benefits, but also some trade-offs to be aware of. And then I would say to ensure decarbonization is equitable for everyone, we need to think about the supporting policies to sort of remedy rather than exacerbate distributional equity gaps. There are a lot of fence line communities that will benefit from decarbonization as we shut down the criteria for pollutant emissions. But if there's a lot of job loss and those jobs move to a different county or people aren't, there can be problems where equity challenges are exacerbated rather than improved, although we see a lot of optimism there for things getting better. So those are the 10 takeaways. Let me walk you through some select results for the scenarios for business as usual, electrification, the advanced clean power version of electrification, hydrogen carriers, and extensive capture. And this is the takeaway. This is total energy demand in Texas, the gray bars, going from about 3,000 terawatt hours of energy today up somewhat to almost 4,000, maybe 3,800 or so terawatt hours in 2050. So energy demand is projected to go in Texas because of population growth and economic growth and that kind of thing. In the brighter colors at the bottom are the portion of the energy that we are getting from electricity, which is about 400 terawatt hours is in electricity in Texas. So a fraction of the total energy consumption in Texas is in the form of electricity. Actually, it's a smaller fraction in Texas compared to most states because we have so much thermal energy demand in Texas for refineries and chemical facilities and for transportation and that kind of thing. So we see that brightly colored part is the part of the economy that is electric. And then in the electrification scenario, the brightly colored part grows a lot from 400 or so to 1,500 or so terawatt hours. And the clean power is the same. And then for hydrogen carriers and direct air capture, even more electricity. So we take out some of the thermal energy in gray and replace it with electricity. And what that does is it brings with it inherent efficiencies. So the total energy demand in 2050 for the electrification scenarios is lower than business as usual. So if we electrify the economy more than we are electrified today, if we go from 400 out of 3,000, so if we go from 1/8 or whatever it is to something more like, I don't know, a third or more, we get efficiencies with it. And that makes, this is a good news story when you get more dollars of GDP or more dollars of value in the economy for less energy input. And that's true across all three of those middle scenarios. The extensive carbon capture scenario is not an efficiency play. If you just keep doing what you've already done and then add a bunch of energy consumption to run the carbon scrubbers, your energy consumption will grow overall. So carbon capture does not look as a sole solution as a very efficient way to go. But electricity and some hydrogen really is good for the economy. So this is exciting that we can make the economy more efficient, not just cleaner. If we look just at the power sector, so now I'm zooming in just on the brightly colored parts at the bottom of that graph, but now zooming in, change the y-axis. We go from about 400 terawatt hours a day up to something, a little over 500 in business as usual, 1,400 plus in the electrification scenarios, 1,600 or so for hydrogen carriers, and then over 2,000 for extensive capture. That's the growth in the electricity, and it shows by colors what the sources will be. The green is wind, the dark gray is coal, the lighter gray is natural gas. There's some storage there in yellow, nuclear, and dark purple. Then there's some geothermal, sort of white, and small modular reactors there in a pinkish purple. And then hydro doesn't even show up, we saw a little bit in Texas. And then we have orange is utility scale solar, and then red, which you better see, is rooftop solar. Wind, as you can see by eye, dominates the narrative. They really say wind and solar dominates the narrative of clean energy in Texas. We're going to build a lot of wind and build a lot of solar. And by the way, the coal shuts down no matter what. In our business as usual case, coal is going to retire by 2035. If you talk to the CEOs of the companies in Texas who own the coal plants, they will tell you they're shutting them down sooner than that. We might be too protective of how we treat coal. It might be completely eliminated in Texas before that. It's just not competitive. And natural gas hangs in there for the most part in gray. So natural gas doesn't go to zero except in this middle scenario, the third scenario, electrification and clean power, where we force the power sector to have zero emissions. Then natural gas will be there. But natural gas hangs in there mostly because of its performance benefits as a backup for when wind and solar aren't available. Nuclear does okay if we really push the power sector to decarbonize by 2035. Geothermal, same kind of story. But this is interesting. It ends up being easier to build wind and solar storage in dispatchable demand than it is to build nuclear and geothermal. Now that could change if new technology come along that drive down the cost of geothermal, like we see with Fervo Energy, a startup that's using hydraulic fracturing techniques to improve the productivity of geothermal and lower the cost. Or some of these small modular reactors for nuclear might come in cheaper than we think. So if our cost assumptions are off, we might see more nuclear and more geothermal in the mix. And then if we have more nuclear and geothermal in the mix, we might have less wind and solar because a gigawatt of capacity of nuclear is not the same as a gigawatt of capacity for wind. Wait, if you look at this just by eye, you can see a lot of growth in renewables, wind and solar. That's the economic solution. We'll come up with the least cost solution while meeting the reliability requirements of the grid. Another way to look at it, I showed you terawatt hours. Now I'm showing you gigawatts of capacity, wind in the upper left, a lot of growth of wind from today's business as usual case for the baseline. Baseline is what we have today, and then business as usual is where it'll go. Utility solar in the upper right. Then we have nuclear in the purple in the middle left, geothermal and biomass on the middle right, and then distributed solar in the bottom left, and storage capacity in the yellow on the bottom right. A lot of growth, all of it is growth. Now, one thing that's interesting is if you look at rooftop solar, it sort of caps out at about 18 gigawatts or so. And there's actually more capacity of rooftop solar in Texas than 18 gigawatts. But at some point, as you add more rooftop solar, you have to spend a lot more money improving your distribution circuits. It ends up being cheaper to expand the transmission circuits and do utility scale solar somewhere else because you have to expand the transmission circuits anyway. So that's an economic decision where for all the scenarios, we'll build a lot of rooftop solar, but at some point, it's more expensive to add more rooftop solar. You'll just build it somewhere else where you can build a large system more cheaply and build the transmission to move it to market. So there's a lot of nuggets in there, but it's a lot of growth. It means to get to net zero in a good way, we're going to build a lot of things, and that's where you get a lot of the economic benefit. The requirement for grid reliability is met with several approaches. I sort of hinted at earlier, diversification of fuel sources. We had a big problem a year ago with the reliance on 50% of our power sector on gas and 20% on wind. In Winter Storm Uri is a roughly windless event, so wind wasn't available the way we wanted, and gas was not reliable. About 50% of statewide gas production froze up, 85% of the production in the Permian. So we were dependent on two primary sources, and both were unreliable for us a year ago. And so diversifying further will help us. Also having geographic distribution of power plants, which is particularly relevant for wind and solar. And then inclusion of dispatchable sources, such as natural gas, nuclear, geothermal. We don't eliminate them to meet our grid reliability requirements. Lots of storage to get built, which will help. Storage especially helps on short-term. Batteries and things like that help for 4 hours or 8 hours, maybe 24 hours. Next generation batteries might be doing 2 to 5 days. And then other types of storage might do your multiple days or multiple weeks of storage that we'll need on occasion. And then significant energy efficiency helps reduce peak demand and that kind of thing. And then we could do a lot of significant demand response with dispatchable industrial loads. This is a key piece of resilience that we don't use today that we really should. And we talk about the line. We have a study coming out from the state of Texas in a couple months on that as well. The low carbon generation sources and storage show significant growth across all scenarios. This is utility scale solar is going to go from a couple gigawatts in 2020. We project might be as high as 75 gigawatts of solar by 2050. Now I'm going to show you why that's preposterous in a second, which is it's too low. The interconnection queue for Ercot already has 105 gigawatts in it for solar. So our analysis shows incredible build out of solar, but the markets have already said they're going to build more than we think. So that's pretty interesting. So we are ambitious, but not ambitious enough with our analysis if the market signals are correct. Distributed solar rooftop is what I just mentioned. Geothermal really only competes really effectively getting several gigawatts if we force the power sector to have zero emissions. We don't allow natural gas in the power sector. Then geothermal looks more competitive. Same kind of story for nuclear, by the way. Wind sees a lot of growth from about 30 something gigawatts today to 100 plus gigawatts in business as usual. So business as usual, no policies, no desire to decarbonize, just market forces alone, according to current conventional standards, shows a tripling of the wind sector, which is really incredible. But if you want to accelerate electrification and decarbonization, then you'll see something like a 10x on wind for electrification, or even something like a 16x or whatever it is, no, it's more than that, 30x on wind to get to the extensive capture scenario. So big growth in wind there. And then same kind of thing with storage, where we might get tens of gigawatts. We already have a lot of gigawatts of storage in the queue. Same kind of story for nuclear, where nuclear does better if we force the electric sector to get to zero emissions. And by the way, if nuclear costs come down, this will look very different. We're using latest numbers we could find for nuclear. And that's the story. All low carbon generation sources show significant growth across all scenarios. Coal goes to zero any way you slice it. Natural gas hangs in there, depending on the scenario. You know, here's a question. Can we really scale the energy sector that quickly? These are big numbers, right? To go up 10x or 3x or 20x or whatever it is. Is tripling of wind by 2050 in the business as usual scenario from 30 to over 100 gigawatts even possible? Can we go up by 10x? What about all the other things we're talking about deploying? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, this is what Texas can do better than just about anywhere. Having lived in California, having lived in France, I will tell you, they cannot move as quickly as Texas when it comes to large scale energy. As of February 2022, so this is a report that came out at the end of January, a few weeks ago, the Ercot interconnection queue already has 105 plus gigawatts of solar, 21 gigawatts of wind, and 52 gigawatts of storage. The markets have already declared some level of intention to build and deploy what these technologies are, like we call for. Not all of this will get built, but just the fact that the market has said it has the capacity and interest to potentially deploy this much is a sign that we might have been too cautious. We also see a lot of build out of wind, not solar analysis. We might be wrong, it might be flipped. It might be we build a lot of solar and less wind and use storage to make up the difference. It kind of depends on where the wires are and that kind of thing. So this is kind of exciting that Texas looks like it wants to scale this quickly. In fact, we have other examples where we've done this. If you look just at oil and gas production, in the last 10 years, oil production went up 5x in the Permian alone and up 4x for gas. So we can take a large industry and scale it even larger in just a decade. If we can go up 5x on a large industry in a decade, we can go up 10x in 30 years. That's kind of the way I feel about it. So it looks to me like we have the capacity to scale, and that's not preposterous at all. Now, if we look at just at the power sector emissions, we are forcing it to decline for our scenarios. And we want them to get as low as possible to enable net zero. But then for the advanced clean power scenario, that third scenario in the middle, we actually get all the way to zero. So the power sector has a little bit of emissions in blue that you'll see for the other scenarios. And we're really trying to drive net CO2 down. That's 1 million metric tons per year. So reduce emissions in the first place, and then use carbon management or scrubbing to take away whatever emissions you still had that you were left over with. And then the non-CO2 emissions decline due to clean electricity, and a double and, we mean it that much, and clean up your act policies. So we really want to clean up what we're doing here. And if you look at the different pollutants of SOx and NOx, particulate matter, different types, and carbon dioxide, and the volatile organic compounds, and methane, and N2O, they all decline. So part of what we assume in building our model is the intent to reduce emissions, which means tightening up the supply chain so you have fewer emissions and you manage things in a better way. So you just have less pollution. And then as you pollute less, you'll get these other environmental benefits as well. The drop in criteria pollutant emissions from power sector is really one of the best byproducts of decarbonization, because that will improve quality of life. It will reduce ozone action days. It will reduce incidences of early death and asthma attacks and people missing time from work to be in the hospital with a loved one, that kind of thing. So this is really one of the benefits is as we clean up the power sector and as we electrify cars, we have less emissions from tailpipes and smokestacks. We will all benefit from that. And then if we look at sort of related emissions, some emissions are still are allowed, so to speak. It's easier for some of those sectors to allow them to keep emitting and then scrub the CO2 out of the atmosphere after the fact, then get it to zero. It's just too hard to electrify that particular sector. This like thing like aviation is one of those, but a lot of industrial activities are like that. And then if we look at the wisdom model, this is a model by Vibrant Clean Energy. It chooses to remove more emissions from direct air capture than point source carbon capture. There's actually an interesting question for us. Carbon capture at the smokestack or direct air capture from the atmosphere of someone else, which one will win in the markets? And people have thought for the last 15 years it'll be carbon capture at the smokestacks, but actually with our analysis, direct air capture ends up being cheaper because you can put it wherever you want. It's easier to site. You don't have to deal with all the other things you do with the smokestacks, but also a lot of the smokestacks go away. Direct air capture ends up being the winner. So we think there's a big carbon management opportunity here If you take hydrogen as one of the priorities, you'll see more of the point source carbon capture that happened, at least in the early years, as record capture matures as a technology. Now, we've assumed in here, based on published literature, $225 per ton is what it costs for record capture to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. The cost in Iceland today is about $1,000 a ton. So we're assuming like a 75% price drop for vector capture, which is in line with what other people think. But it might be actually, it ends up being cheaper than that. If we look to other examples over history for price drops in technology, let me give this one from the price of solar modules, which have dropped 99.6% over the last few decades. It is possible that vector capture costs will drop from $1,000 a ton today in Iceland to more like $100 a ton or less if it follows the same curve as solar or batteries or wind turbines and that kind of thing. In that case, the analysis will look better. It'll be even easier for us to get to net zero, or we could go to carbon negative, which would be pretty exciting because then Texas has a lot of places to put that carbon. Maybe the world will pay us handsomely to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the ground, which is what Iceland's doing. They're getting paid to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. If you look at the emissions, this is kind of another way to tell the same story. We have a lot of emission reduction potentials. It depends on the scenario you look at. A lot of it is electrification, efficiency, fuel substitution, avoiding emissions in the first place. Then we use direct capture in all the scenarios. That blue is there. Direct capture is a winner anyway you slice it, as is electrification and hydrogen. But in the extensive capture scenario, we don't change the behaviors of fuels. We just scrub it after the fact. So that really depends a lot on direct capture. And that's where you get some of those costs and energy requirements and land requirements. And if you put a cost on pollution, which we think you always should, I'm always embarrassed when I see economic analysis that doesn't include the cost of pollution, then you get a lot of benefits. So a lot of the economic benefits from decarbonizing is the avoidance of the social cost of carbon or the mortality cost of carbon and the impact of the criteria pollutants. Reducing and avoiding those emissions really has value for us economically. And then we can put it all together, these numbers, okay, careful, really look at the relative, but we anticipate the economy in Texas is going to grow just because we'll have more people. And any economists will say, well, you have more people, you have more activity, you'll have growth in the economy. Sure, there'll be wiggles along the way, but generally they'll be growing. Right now, we're over $1.5 trillion as an economy. So we're almost the size of France for an economy, which is incredible. And that will grow in the business as usual scenario. However, that business as usual scenario includes the cost of pollution. If you have a cleaner society and less air pollution, you get even more economic benefits. And so you get a better sort of net economic benefit for the system from these decarbonized scenarios. They all look better for the economy overall, if you include the cost of pollution, than the business as usual scenario. So it's not an economy killer. In fact, it might be an economy enhancer, which is very exciting. And hydrogen carriers might be the biggest enhancer because you get the air quality benefits, but also you get a lot of other investments that happen with hydrogen. Then you'll see that with some of the jobs numbers. So if we look just at the power sector jobs, this shows loss to the left of the zero and job gain to the right. And this is in thousands. There's a lot of loss of jobs at the coal plants that retire, and all of them retire in every scenario we look at. There'll be a loss of jobs at some of the natural gas combined cycle power plants. But then you'll also pick up a lot of jobs in wires and poles and transmission and distribution, also wind and storage and solar and some nuclear and that kind of thing. So the job creation, hundreds of thousands of jobs per type of fuel, more than makes up for the loss of jobs in the power sector from those power plants are shutting down. Now, depending on how you treat the oil and gas sector, there might or might not be loss of jobs there too. So there might be loss of jobs in the gas sector if we're using less gas, but those jobs might be made up for by creation of jobs in the hydrogen sector, which is why we think the hydrogen scenario is a big job creator, because the oil and gas industry ends up making hydrogen and managing carbon. So some of the scenarios include all the parts of the economy, not just the power sector, are net job creators. Other scenarios look about the same as business as usual. There are also some other trade-offs. There's some environmental co-benefits from avoided water use, at least for several scenarios. We avoid a lot of water for cooling thermal power plants by using wind and solar. That's really good for business as usual electrification. However, the hydrogen scenario might be a push on water consumption at the top, because you use water as a feedstock for electrolysis to make hydrogen, at least the way we assume hydrogen would be made. By the way, there are many ways to make hydrogen. It might not be by electrolysis or steam methane reforming. It could be by pyrolysis or photolysis or biological pathways. So we end up concluding that a lot of the hydrogen will be made by adding electricity to water with electrolysis to get hydrogen. And if that's the case, you don't get a lot of avoided water use the way, or water consumption the way you might for electrification. So that's a trade-off to be mindful of. There are also land trade-offs. Renewables tend to be very diffuse, therefore you need more land. So you have to put wind and solar over more places. but you can do other things with it. So it doesn't really consume the land the way a coal mine might, that kind of thing. And this shows where the land use is and what is happening by color in the different spots. And this will all be available in the report in detail. You can see maybe in the bottom right that there's a lot of carbon capture that we've done in the Panhandle in West Texas. A lot of wind construction in green in many places throughout the state, but not Austin. Austin tends to be resourceless. We're rich in human capital, but not the natural resources. But you can see where you might be building the different things based on where the resources, where it's cheapest to do it. Net conclusion of all this is that there are multiple ways to net zero, and we can lead the way. And frankly, it's good for us to do it. I mean, I think this is a great news story economically and environmentally, and from a security perspective, which is really great. And I really want to thank the project's many collaborators. It was a big project that's finally wrapping up. The team at Austin, I mean, there are 8 or 9 of us on that list right there. The eight people. We also had a few people vibing clean energy, CU Boulder, and energy innovation. And Dr. Isabella Yee here is a lead author, so I appreciate her being here to help me answer questions. So we'll stop there. Thank you so much for your interest. Happy to take your questions now.
Okay, I think we can pass the mic around if anybody has any questions in the room. And there's at least one question online,
Okay.
Which was actually, is there any assumption of a cost of carbon in this analysis, or is it just analysis independent of the cost of carbon and just what happens if you build this stuff?
So so Isabella, you want to help me answer that? Build? Yeah, so there's no implicit cost of carbon put in, but we do mandate or drive carbon to zero. So we force carbon to zero, but we did not just make carbon more expensive. But then you conclude how expensive was it for society to get to zero, but actually conclude it wasn't expensive. It was economically beneficial. But we didn't put a tax on carbon.
Right. All right, any question? If you have a question in the room, raise your hand and then we'll come to the mic here. So we'll go, yeah.
So thank you for that. I just saw a similar analysis for you. It brought to mind the question where everything to business as usual, you're changing behavior, right? You're changing production, consumption behavior. Have you modeled how you're going to change behavior? How are you going to use policies to change policy? Who's going to pay for those transitions?
Great question. Thank you for hosting us at the LBJ school, by the way. It's nice to have the dean in attendance. So appreciate your question. This was not a behavioral analysis. And so we did not sort of model what might it take to change a consumer's behavior or a decision maker's behavior at the company. We start with the assumption and the forcing function that CO2 emissions will drop. And then within that, we'll try to avoid mandates and that kind of thing. It's sort of like, what's the lowest cost way to get to zero? So we always use the main behavioral thing is we assume the cheapest pathway within these scenarios will be the preferred one, which is a very American thing, by the way. In Europe, you might not choose the least cost pathway. You might choose the one that's most philosophically pure or most regionally local or whatever it is. But we use the least cost approach, which is sort of an American bias, I'd say. But didn't do a lot of behavioral analysis on that. The assumption there is really like these decisions will happen to meet the constraint to decarbonization, which might be a preposterous assumption, by the way. However, what we're finding is our analysis aligns with what the markets have already decided. So in some ways, it feels like we're predicting the next 30 years, yet it feels like we're 2 years late. The market's already made this decision up 2 years ago. The behavior is already changing in many sectors. If we especially look at just the power sector, with what the power sector has decided, the power sector has decided it will shut down coal, struggle to build gas, build wind, solar, and storage, which is exactly what our analysis includes. So far, there's a lot of alignment between what the behaviors are and what we're suggesting would be a good way to get to net zero. But we didn't really deal with that. But now we did. There are efficiency standards, there are cleanliness standards, we dealt with those policies within our analysis about making buildings more efficient, appliances more efficient, reducing emissions of fugitive gases and that kind of thing. But there really wasn't any behavioral work. And that might be a great thing for some follow work as the people that would explore, okay, well, what decisions have to be changed? And by whom? Is it the consumers that change? Or are we just going to buy the cheapest thing that we get? What I separately think that's not specific to this analysis is there's so much pressure now from consumers, employees, and investors that companies are changing already for the most part. So there's investor pressure for companies to change what they build and how they build it, that kind of thing. That's from ESG finance, and this environmental social governance finance, which is like a third of the capital out there now is ESG money. And they're saying, we won't give you money for coal, but we will give you money for green ammonia or hydrogen. And company might say, well, oil and gas is cheaper than hydrogen. ESG investor will say, we don't care. You don't get money for this, but you do get money for that. So the behavior has already changed for like a third of the capital out there. Employees are now demanding that the companies change. What's our ESG policy? What's our net zero policy? So companies are coming up with these statements and plans for net zero based on investor pressure and employee pressure. And now consumers are demanding. Now consumers aren't always so sophisticated because we demand a cleaner thing, but we demand it be cheaper and available, you know, at all times and this kind of thing. But the pressure's coming from all ways. So we didn't really look at that in the study, but it looks like the markets are arriving at some of the same answers we suggest would be reasonable. That's my long way of saying we didn't study what you asked, but that's a great question.
It is a good long answer to it.
Yeah, I give the longest non-answer.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great work. He has a humanities degree from UT as well.
yeah.
So
My
he got those
degree
skills.
is really paid off.
It's not just an engineer. Yeah. Okay, that's showing those skills. So here's a question, I guess, from me in your talk. So I know, yeah, you're one of those who has written on Ercot should think about connecting to the other grids.
I have written on that.
You did not talk about that today or in the context of your presentation, but in the context of decarbonizing Texas. Is it better for the world that Texas keeps itself isolated to force itself to deal with harder engineering challenges than it would be if it connected to the other grids?
That's a great question.
Because what here starts here changes the world, according to UT Austin. So is that the best way to change the world, is to remain isolated from the electric grid?
So there are many layers. So I wrote an op-ed, so the New York Times say Texas should connect to the rest of the grid, and the CEO of Ercot and the former and current chair of public television all had responses for that, which I thought was interesting. But the idea of whether Texas should be connected is important. For this analysis, Texas was isolated. We're like, what can we do to isolate and keep Texas isolated and get to zero? And Texas is a few % of global emissions. So just getting Texas net zero actually has a global impact. It will be beneficial for the world. If we were to connect Texas more, we're already connected by pipeline for gas, by LNG, by ship, by oil and refined products by ship, and we export biomass pellets and that kind of thing. So already connected on many forms of energy, and probably would continue to be so. But the question is, would we be for the power sector, which we're not really connected right now? We export molecules, why not export electrons? If we connected, it's actually a good question, would that accelerate decarbonization of Texas or not? I have a feeling that all the ambitious build that I showed you for wind and solar, we would build even more, and we would build it even faster if we're connected, because other states would be asking for it. If you're West Virginia or California wants to decarbonize, it will be easier for you to buy low carbon electrons from Texas than to build your own, so to speak. So it becomes a way to create an export market of clean power. So I imagine even more growth and even more money and higher prices, which justifies an earlier adoption and acceleration of that. I don't really know that because we haven't done that analysis, but that'd be a great follow-on study if there are any sponsors listening to us right now. So I think we kept Texas isolated for the study. And frankly, getting Texas to zero is a little bit like getting Germany to zero or Australia to zero or Canada to zero. So that would have a pretty big global impact and have a ripple effect. But you could argue that connecting our power market would improve the finances of that decision and accelerate the timeline.
Okay, there's a couple more. There's another question. Maybe I'll add a part of it to it. In your presentation, you showed a map of 12 regions of Texas. I guess that was perhaps what the question is, why choose those regions? But I'm going to add on to that, which is to sort of make the notion that Texas has been an exporter of energy and we can sell energy to others. So in the scope of life cycle assessments and scopes of emissions, how do you view, how much of the consumption of the energy generated in Texas is within Texas, and how much of the economic benefit is, for the earlier question, someone outside of Texas has to buy those products?
Yeah, there's a great
Versus
question.
inside of Texas, so the regions and then.
The economic regions, we do not choose, that's by the state comptroller's office. It's pretty standard dividing. We just took their 12 regions, consolidated 2 of them in 2 places to get it down to 10, just to make the analysis more tractable. But those are not boundaries we drew. That's pretty, Texas does its economic analysis by those regions anyway. So we just adopted the same boundaries, so it would be sort of easy to synthesize and harmonize with other publications that are out there. This idea of scope 1 versus scope 2 versus scope 3 emissions, it's one thing to get Texas to net zero, but which is like scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But it's another thing to get the products that Texas sells to zero, which would be scope 3. And our analysis really focused on the first scopes, getting Texas's direct emissions to net zero, meaning the things that our operations, you almost said like scope 2 emissions, like our operations would be net zero. But it assumes that we're still exporting gas and oil, which might be burned elsewhere, would have emissions. We did not include those emissions And if you include those, emissions would be non-trivial, and significant. We assume those are on those people's books, which is not the way we do it today, by the way. So right now in the States, we decarbonize by shutting down a factory, moving the factory to China. China has emissions instead, but we say that's on China's books on average. So the way we did it is not the way the world really does it, which is we don't count the emissions from products that are burned at Texas exports. And we also don't know if those products will really be exported. Like we're assuming that the market exists for export of oil and gas. However, there might be some positive notion that if we develop a lot of capability in hydrogen, we could export that instead in some form. Maybe not hydrogen, but maybe in carrier form of ammonia or methanol or something like that. And if we get really good at carbon capture, we might be paying them to take carbon out of the atmosphere. We showed the carbon capture just to decarbonize our emissions, but we could do more of it. We showed the potential for one of the scenarios. We could decarbonize other countries that maybe don't have a carbon capture infrastructure or locations to inject the CO2 or that kind of thing. So we didn't include that, but I think that would be a great follow-on analysis. Like, okay, we got Texas to zero, but we're selling a product that doesn't have zero elsewhere. What does that mean if we want to get that to zero as well?
Right. Well, maybe I'll take your last statement to go to this other question. There's one specific area. So carbon capture, you showed essentially that direct air capture dominates scenarios, which is in some sense saying something because carbon capture hasn't dominated reality at all. So I don't know, how do you view the scenarios, assumptions about direct air capture to reach your scenarios and
frankly,
plausibility?
Carbon capture doesn't dominate. Wind, solar, storage, efficiency dominate. And then what's left over, which you can't solve by wind, solar, storage, efficiency, we solve with carbon capture. So it really is getting like the last 20% or something like that. It's a small minority of the overall system. And then within that fraction, we're competing to carbon capture, direct capture looks like the winner. Primarily because of its flexibility in siting, where you can put it, and its flexibility in operations. You can turn it on and off pretty easily to match when wind is available, whereas carbon capture at point source of smokestack, you're less likely or less able to look at it. So it is harder to site kind of thing. So really carbon capture is the fifth winner, the first four being these other things I mentioned, efficiency, storage and wind and solar, and then you get the fifth winner. And then within that, direct air capture dominates over point source carbon capture. But even point source carbon capture has a role to play also.
Okay, we got a question as we come around with the mic, so for the microphone of the question. Here's it's a kind of related question. Well, it's on organization from the web. What level of organization do you think can stimulate these investments? This is kind of like the behavioral change question earlier, but maybe a little bit more tuned towards, I don't know, governments or industry and what levels of industry.
What level of organization do we need? Well, I'd like to see more organization, but Texas is not a well-organized state. Like by design, we don't make decisions in an organized way. We make it in a disorganized market way for a variety of reasons. It's cheaper, aligns with our philosophy and that kind of thing. And that's in contrast with France. By the way, France is very well organized. Decisions will be centralized and that kind of thing. And there are benefits and disbenefits to that. But Texas is not organized. And we didn't assume any particular level of organization. The main assumption we put on this is emissions will go to zero. And we don't know if we'll get there because we all decide to get there because it's cheapest, there's a government mandate. We don't really specify that mechanism other than it will go to zero. And I would suggest that more organization would be good for us as Texas, but that's almost like a personal ideological bias. We don't require that. It's like that's not a dictated element of the analysis. And you could argue actually that Texas' disorganized structure is better because Texas is actively decarbonizing now faster than just about anywhere in the world, especially compared to most organized countries that have made pledges. France and Germany come to mind where they're organized, made a pledge and haven't taken action. The only place in the world that is organized and decarbonizing is probably the UK, I would say. And the UK is decarbonizing pretty quickly as well. So you use the UK as an example that you should be organized and plan for it and intentional and you can decarbonize. Texas is an example of you should be disorganized, chaotic, and you'll decarbonize. Like both are getting to the same answer, which is pretty interesting. And so I don't know which one would be best, but the Texas spirit, probably disorganized, chaotic market, we'll get to the right answer, even if we got there for the wrong reasons, if that makes sense.
I'm used to that a little bit of background politics. Can you speak to the relevance of political predictability and the policies and model traditional and alternative solutions to be spent 5, 10, 50-year investment decisions in the sense of uncertainty about the particular policy will persist? I think that tax credits of the past or efficiency incentives, could that political uncertainty undermine the effect of certain policies?
Great question. Will political uncertainty potentially undermine this? Absolutely. So political uncertainty is very expensive. I think price volatility is expensive, but policy volatility is expensive. Turn a policy on, turn it off 2 years later, turn it back on 2 years later. That kind of volatility really disrupts capital investment decision making. And so stable policy is actually more important than good policy in many respects. Like predictable, stable policy that you can plan for is really useful as opposed to policy volatility. I don't know how you quantify policy volatility. That's a huge problem. But just so you know, for the policy we considered, like the tax credits, we built in the assumption that they expire when they're settled to expire. We didn't build in the assumption of permanence in policies, other than maybe like efficiency and constant drive for improvement on emissions. So we didn't build in any policy assumptions like that on stability. And it's a huge risk because someone can come in as they're trying to do in Ohio, they're trying to do in Texas right now, and mandate that you have to use dirtier fuels. And they're like in Texas, they're trying to make it more expensive to build renewables, for example. In Ohio, they're trying to protect coal. So politics and policy can intervene to stop the progress, I would say, or really slow the progress. My personal bias is that the market has spoken and the market will win. Politics can slow down or accelerate the path, but the path has been already determined. That's what it looks like to me. And so Texas politicians trying to slow the build out of renewables might slow it, but can't stop it because the renewables become their own political force, frankly. They employ so many people and make a lot of money, this kind of thing. So politics is bumpy and choppy, and that pays a cost that ends up being expensive for us. So I'd like to see it better, but I kind of think the path is already set. But Isabella, was there more on policy? I'm trying to think, what did I miss? And I don't know if we can get them on to Isabella. But you should direct cover. Okay, great.
Well, maybe since the one major carbon capture facility in Texas decided to shut down, and your analysis says point source carbon capture isn't going to happen. Maybe,
And that was
maybe
point
you're
source
getting,
carbon capture. But direct air capture in Iceland just launched.
Yeah.
So, and I got to visit that site in August, by the way, which is really incredible. And now it's sort of like direct air capture, but also kind of point source capture, like it's at a power plant and all that kind of thing, but it's capturing from the sky. But they inject it into the basalt where it mineralizes and is sequestered for geological time frames, like millions of years. Which is pretty exciting.
all right, I think we got time for one last question here.
Mine was about the technology presumptions you made in terms of their cost, because you put in a cost guideline for carbon capture, which is restoration at 2.5. But I was wondering what you presumed for other technologies, and then what technology might all be based on.
So we didn't build in cost declines for direct air capture, which probably we could have should have, but who knows what that's going to be. So it was 225. I can't remember for wind and solar as well, but we used, but I think we kept them pretty stable. Is that right for wind and solar?
Yeah, so
You give her the mic.
mostly from what I remember, the NRL ATB study for a lot of cost assumptions, and BCE has its own kind of standard assumptions for cost for those technologies. For direct air capture, we based it off of a published study that ended up with a levelized cost of 225, but I believe that Wisdom actually can factor its own electricity costs. And so that's where you see a lot of the benefits is when we have a very highly interoperable grid system with a low cost electricity feeding into what we have as a primarily electric direct air capture and sequestration, you get the benefits. We also had, I don't know off the top of my head, carbon capture costs for power sector, but we also had industrial carbon capture, which also didn't win out, although that one I think maybe had more of a set cost, but we didn't decline or assume any kind of learning curve with the CapEx and OpEx for direct air capture because it's more good or kind of emerging. There are also plenty of other mitigation options like enhanced rock weathering and other ocean carbon removal options that we didn't look at, but we also discussed. We also didn't include bioenergy with carbon capture and storage as well. That's not included in BC's model. So we kind of looked at this a little bit as, you know, direct air capture has a lot of really good benefits, but there's also mostly just kind of a carbon mitigation potential in general, and the market might end up determining a more diverse mix of mitigation.
So just let me capture a couple of those points. We're using published data, which is almost always a few years behind and wrong. And so the numbers might be even cheaper for everything we're talking about, which means even more rapid success than what we said. We also have, those are a lot of assumptions built in. You see, we might be wrong on wind versus solar because of that, where we're seeing more wind than solar. It might be the other way around. There are also a lot of technologies we didn't consider, either because the cost is too high or there wasn't solid data included in the model. And so Isabella mentioned a couple that we didn't include, like rock weathering, and some solar carbon sequestration, that kind of thing. But we also didn't include many pathways for hydrogen, which frankly, I think there'll be other pathways for hydrogen. So there's a lot of technologies missing from this. that perhaps we could include, but they're so new, there's not even like a price, much less a technology learning curve and that kind of thing. That answers your answer. But I think all of those things give us an upward bias, meaning we make it look too expensive. And so all of the things we left out mean that getting to zero is probably faster and cheaper. Like, and none of them are biased the other way, I don't think. Although maybe we're leaving out cost declines for conventional options like coal and natural gas. If the coal industry plummets, then coal becomes cheaper. Maybe coal hangs in there or something like that. So that's kind of the limitation of the type of study we do. We can only look at so many technologies and pathways and that kind of thing.
That was my last question, is we could have this external function driving it down. How expensive do you think?
I mean, I think so. To repeat the question for the Zoom audience, did we accidentally make it look more expensive? That's my hunch. I don't really know. I do have an article out this month in the Decarbonizing magazine called Climate Optimism, where I actually argue that we will get to net zero faster than anyone thinks. So we're showing net zero by 2050. Just my personal philosophy and belief and my hunch is we will actually get there before 2050. So for the reasons that you asked about, but our analysis doesn't show that, but we might be pleasantly surprised. And it also could take longer for a variety of reasons, the politics, the volatility you mentioned. There might be things we just didn't foresee, or there might be some land constraints or siting permit problems. But we think 2050 has many pathways. I wouldn't be surprised if we get there early. I mean, the thing about Texas, the thing about the United States is, and I really see this having lived in Europe many times in my life now. And this is such a sort of classic thing. My friends who work in Europe say the Americans always arrive late, but they throw a lot of money at it and then get to the end line first, which is kind of annoying to European and other competitors, by the way. And Winston Churchill said it this way, which is you can always count on Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other possible option, right? This is the thing. And so we get there late, but then we play to win. And so I think we're getting there late, but then we're going to do very quickly and scale very, very quickly. And Texas is kind of a microcosm of that. And Texas is also a harder case. There's such industrial emissions and this energy intensity. But I think if we can do it, then anyone can do it. And we can do it by 2050. In fact, we might do it sooner because we'll discover there's a big market for that outside of Texas.
All right, so certainly as I say in my book, the techno optimism there, right?
Techno-optimism, yeah,
Right,
sorry.
right.
And read Kerry's book, because he actually puts formulas behind a lot of these philosophies.
There's no formulas in my book, don't scare me.
But you give rigor to these philosophies that are said that.
Formulas in the paper. All right, so great first talk for the Energy Week. Thank you very much. Good luck. Online audience, I think we'll return at 5:15, so in about 15 minutes. Thank you. All right. Well, whirlwind of talking. Maybe we could have techno-optimism versus techno-realism for the semester. It could be that.
That would be great. Yeah, let's do that.
I don't know. We could have too much fun.
All right, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you back. And are you hearing me okay? All right. Thank you so much. So I'm excited to welcome everybody here for the first time that we've done this sort of in-person virtual career event for graduate students at UT in the energy, environment, and sustainability space. So I'm going to help host this afternoon. My name is Eric Funkhauser with the UT Energy Institute. So we're partnering tonight with the LBJ School to host this event. First up, we're going to hear from LBJ School Dean J.R. DeShazo, after which we have two separate panels with one panel set coming from hiring managers from and representatives from organizations across the US. And then we have an in-person panel of some local folks who are here visiting or from the Austin metro area, all of whom are going to share some thoughts about careers in the energy space, sustainability, power, climate change. So we'll get to that in a moment, but before we get into our outside guests, I'd like to first welcome LBJ School Dean J.R. DeShazo to get us kicked off.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Welcome to the LBJ School. Thank you, Dr. Weber, for that presentation that you just made on Texas's energy transition. And I want to thank the Energy Institute for kicking off Energy Week here at UT. And I most of all want to thank the panels that we are having in front of us, all the different employers who are coming to help our students understand what the career opportunities look like in this space. The energy and carbon space is a complicated one. I think probably the simplest way to think about it is as made up of nonprofits and the government sector, which formulates policy, and then the for-profit or market sector, which produces energy and other goods and services, right? And energy and decarbonization involve a complicated relationship between those three: nonprofits, the public sector, and the for-profit sector. And I think what our students' experiences often are is they start in one of those three, but it's really important to understand what the other two are, what they do. And one of the great things about being here at UT is you will have an opportunity to learn about advocacy and policy development, to think about policy design as it relates to the way firms are going to react to those policies and produce energy and other goods and services. And so the interaction between, well, and if we think about this, the most common sort of model, right, is that nonprofits advocate for change. They might be focused on reducing carbon emissions, or they might be focused on environmental justice. In either case, they frequently are going to be demanding new developments in policy, right? And those policies usually constrain or change the behavior of energy producing firms and energy consuming consumers. And a lot of what you're going to hear tonight is in different organizations who play different roles within that energy ecosystem, right? The careers that you can have, the skills that you're going to need are going to vary. But internships, I think, are going to be a really common theme, because the energy sector, I've done a lot of work in my own past on water, biological conservation, electric vehicles, but air pollution. Energy is one of the most complex and Byzantine sectors, and it varies from state to state. And so one of the things that most of us have to do when we get into the energy world is really learn about it in the workplace. And so I'm grateful that you're here and sort of invite you to ask questions of our panel. I want to thank our two panels for being here. Without you, UT couldn't continue to supply the world with eager, passionate, inquisitive students who really kind of want to make our motto, "What starts here changes the world," true. So all for being here, and I look forward to meeting you. Eric?
Thank you so much. All right. Well, first of all, aren't we lucky to have a dean of the LBJ school who's in our space in the energy and environmental space? That was a very exciting thing for UT to have had happen over the last year. So that's a very exciting development. And also to have so many faculty at the LBJ school focus on energy, climate change, and power transition. So I want to give you a little bit of a rundown of how the rest of the program is going to go. So first of all, what I want to note to you is we have an audience here in-house, but we also have a large audience watching this stream on YouTube. We'll be able to field in some questions, and I'll have runners bringing me questions through that feed. So if you're watching us via YouTube, please feel free to continue to put questions in the comment area. And I'll bring them to either our online virtual panelists or our panelists here in person. So I want to put one plug out there before I even tell you what these panels are about. First of all, almost like with a couple of exceptions, most of these are people who have stayed very active with UT Austin after having completed graduate school at UT. There are a couple of exceptions, but I also invited these people in, the folks you'll see tonight in particular, because a number of them have a history of also hiring UT graduates and looking for rigorous candidates who've gone to a graduate program and apply themselves and done interesting work while in grad school. So by dint of participating in this, we're hoping that you're like following in their footsteps and here to kind of bring that same energy into the space and continue this tradition. So the first panel that we're going to hear from our visitors that are visiting us from around the country. So I want to give you a short rundown. Now, these virtual visitors, they're going to go through a couple of questions and tell us about their organization. They're going to answer one key question that I want y'all to take in, which is what do folks who are postgraduate, who have a graduate degree, actually do in these organizations in their first 5 years after grad school? So these early career professionals, I won't actually ask this question to the audience, but if I were, like, I wonder how confident you would be that you could describe a lot of what people do in their first 5 years in the active day-to-day work of an organization once you have your graduate degree. We wanted to demystify that to make you more successful applicants and also get you more excited about the kind of places that you want to work when you finish at UT. So they're going to answer that question. They're going to tell us their organization, and then they're going to tell us just a little bit more about who they specifically look for and how to get in front of hiring managers. If you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand. We're going to have to mediate those through me for the virtual panel. When we bring our in-person guests down, you'll be able to ask questions directly here in the room as well as on YouTube. So let me tell you just a little bit. I'm going to start calling on them one by one, but let me just as prelude, let me give you a little introduction to who the organizations that we'll be speaking with. First, we have a representative who is a UT alum who will be joining us from Motor, which is also AES Power. We have a representative from Nyserda, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, one of the largest public agencies working in clean energy market transportation in the country as well as in the world. You should look them up. We also have a representative from Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy, somebody from the Oregon Department of Energy. And to get the afternoon started off, I'm going to ask Vineet Raman from Motor to join us now and kind of start us off with his comments. So here's Vineet.
Hey everyone, it's nice to see you. Like Eric mentioned, my name is Vineet. I'm with a company called Motor, is a corporate incubation out of AES Corporation. AES is a large Fortune 500 power and utilities company that owns and operates utilities and renewable energy projects around the world. Motor itself is a corporate startup that is 100% owned by AES that is focused on accelerating consumer EV adoption by leveraging retail utilities as the main channel to reach customers. My role with Motor is in business development, which on a startup team means whatever you want it to mean. My primary focuses are on supporting a capital raise, reaching out to potential utility partners, yeah, honestly, like some product development even in there as well. Motor is a little bit strange because it's a startup within a larger company, so I'll spend most of my time talking about AES in general. Because AES is a very diverse energy company, there's pretty much every functional role under the sun at AES. So if you're interested in renewable energy project finance, there are roles for that. Market analysis, origination. If you're interested in kind of the traditional utility space, there are corporate finance jobs, accounting roles, construction jobs, pretty much anything you can imagine. AES is right now growing a lot. There's a lot of goals to kind of decarbonize their assets. So the renewable energy part of the business is growing a lot. If you're interested in learning more, I would look up AES Clean Energy, and I'll offer up, if you find a role that's interesting to you, please reach out and I'll find out who the hiring manager is and put you in touch. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have. Back to you, Eric.
Great. Thanks, Vineet. So Vineet brings up a good point. I want to point out, I didn't ask, since this is airing on YouTube, I didn't ask folks to put up their email address directly, but I want to confirm that I have everybody's email address. So if you're a grad student who's sufficiently motivated to meet any of the folks you see tonight, just email me. My email's everywhere, or talk to me. However you want to get a hold of me, I will respond and I will put you in touch. Whether or not they consent, I will put you in touch with these folks. So Vinny, thank you so much. It's always great to see you around, and that's a very specific role. So we appreciate your remarks. So next up, I'd like to invite from ClimateWorks, Francis Wang. And Francis, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. So I'm Francis Wang. I'm the program manager of the carbon dioxide removal portfolio at ClimateWorks Foundation. ClimateWorks is a philanthropic and nonprofit organization based in San Francisco. We work in 50 countries with 500 grantees, and currently there's about 80 to 90 staff in ClimateWorks and globally. We probably have about 50% US staff and 50% non-Americans. ClimateWorks itself focuses on climate mitigation strategies across 10 different programmatic areas, such as clean transportation, clean cooling, food and agriculture, sustainable finance, and of course, carbon removal is where I sit. Early career professionals typically join ClimateWorks at the associate level. So associates often have graduate degrees with a few years of work experience in the relevant fields that they will be staffing. For example, these experiences may be climate or public policy, energy or engineering. And in the associate position, their work is to support the program on both the operation side, so budgeting, grants administration, report writing, as well as to support the research on the content and strategy development. Program managers are responsible for grant making and strategy, and typically have a graduate degree with 5 to 7 years of experience in a specific content area that they manage. For example, my background is in energy and economics policy, with a focus on how new technology proliferates and is deployed responsibly. I initially joined ClimateWorks as an associate in the Clean Energy, Clean Air program, which works on transitioning away from coal. I then later switched to carbon removal program to focus on how to incentivize negative emissions technology. In terms of the skills that we look for, I would categorize them into hard and soft skills. Typically, we hire people with relevant quantitative or qualitative skills and knowledge in the portfolio areas that we work. For example, for CDR, we look for individuals with a deep understanding of the energy system for the initiative on negative emissions technologies, or an understanding of the ocean climate interactions for the marine carbon sequestration initiative. Because the program also has a heavy policy focus, we look for individuals who understand climate policy processes or have direct experience in policymaking. On the soft skill side, we typically look for individuals who is adaptable and is able to pick up new topics quickly. I would say adaptability is probably the most important skill to have, because philanthropy at its heart is about filling in gaps where public or private sectors weren't able to do that, and being able to identify trends and seize opportunities that arise within a rapidly shifting landscape. In addition, we also look for individuals who have interdisciplinary experience, for example, in environmental justice issues. And because carbon removal is transboundary, we look for individuals who have worked in other countries or contexts to help us diversify the perspective within the organization. I'll stop there. Back to you, Eric.
Fantastic. Francis, thank you so much. What a totally unique perspective. It's really it's such a critical role in the climate change world to be in the philanthropic foundations and endowments that work in this space on kind of the high upstream area. So it's really special to have somebody from your area here to give us to impart a little bit of wisdom. We really appreciate it. So Francis mentioned something that was a specific request from so many graduate students at UT when we announced we were going to put on this event, which is environmental justice, energy poverty, those areas of this budding area where we're seeing more and more focus and investment. So for our next panelist, I'm going to invite up Nina Lobo. So Nina is also a UT alum, and she's working with the Coalition for Community Solar Access. So Nina, I'm going to ask you to jump in now and give us your thoughts.
Sure, thanks, Eric. As Eric said, I'm at the Coalition for Community Solar Access, which I'll abbreviate as CCSA. It's a mouthful. I'm a policy and regulatory associate there, and we work right at that intersection you heard about earlier of the nonprofit, the for-profit, and the public sector. So CCSA is essentially an industry trade association for 90 community solar businesses and nonprofits across the country. So we don't build community solar projects, but we advocate on behalf of our members to get bills and policies passed that enable them to then do business and build those projects. But we also shape more visionary aspects of the energy industry by advocating for more distribution grid investment, equitable energy incentives. We do a lot of work with environmental justice and community-based organizations on the ground in each state to advocate for these different policies. And then we also, through those policies, aim to ensure discounted energy rates, specifically for low-income communities and those who've traditionally been left out of the clean energy transition through those members' projects. Community solar, I should add, is a sort of emerging model of solar. There's different forms that it takes, but through the industry lens, it tends to be medium-sized solar projects where multiple households or businesses can subscribe to it. With residential, it typically just benefits that one facility that's built on. But in this case, you have to kind of have this partnership with the utility that enables bill credits to be put onto the subscribers' bills. And that's what enables people to have that energy access. So, for example, in places where people don't own their homes or their roofs are in bad condition, which tends to be the case in a lot of areas that typically don't have, good infrastructure for whatever economic reasons, this is a way for them to access the clean energy transition. And overall, I would say we are a pretty small organization, roughly 14 people, and I'm also the only early stage professional there. So my job is kind of unique in that I play a role of working on policies in different states, understanding those different legislative sessions and what we need to do, whether it's a conservative or liberal environment, to help things pass there. I also work on the regulatory side, supporting different directors in making sure the rules are really laid out so that we can have programs that work on effective timelines with costs and fees that work for every player in the market, not just the industry, but also making sure that those discounted energy rates make it to the right people that are intended to receive them. And then it's a lot of coalition building too. So working with environmental justice organizations, other trade associations to make sure that we have this kind of cohesive approach to what the energy transition looks like, rather than kind of, having different infighting that can happen in different sections of emerging industries. I would say that as an early professional, if you're applying to a field like this, again, my organization has about 14 people in it, but we're connected to 90 organizations. So please reach out. I think all the points that Vineet mentioned around like the different types of jobs you can experience, all of those are available to you here. So what I would say is, if you want to reach out to people, network with them on LinkedIn. The community solar industry is super active over there. They look for, again, all the things that Francis mentioned, people who are adaptable, ambitious, smart, have experience in engineering or policy or whatever it may be. But specifically at my organization, if you have a background in energy policy or environmental management, those would definitely come in useful. Here, you would probably enter as an associate or a manager level. You would rise up to a director and be overseeing a general market, which you could do within 5 years if you work hard at it. Ercot, I think that's all I have to say. Back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Nina. That was so good. Nina is special because, well, one, she's brilliant, but she's special also because she works for a very large network organization. So like she said, if you look at CCSA, their member base is a huge network of other nonprofits and for-profit organizations through which they serve as an active kind of do tank and policy resource. So Nina, thank you so much for your help. So next, I want to bring on John Cornwell from the Oregon Department of Energy. John, before you get started, I want to ask you for one thing. John is special, just like everybody else on the panel, not in the world, but everybody else on the panel, because he has a very long career in the energy space. So John, I'm going to add one additional question to you that I didn't ask the others, which is I'd like you to just give us just a little bit of your background in the broad energy consulting world, and then talk about your role with the Oregon DOE.
Sure, thanks, Eric. And thanks for having me here. It's great to be back at UT, even if it's virtual. I wish I was in Austin with you, but I'm up here in the rainy Northwest. As Eric mentioned, my name is John Cornwell. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy. Prior to this position, I was at UT as a graduate student. Before that, I spent 7 years as in a consulting role with a energy economics firm conducting a wide range of projects, typically evaluating energy programs, from energy efficiency to renewables programs, all the way through to research and development and emerging technologies programs. It's been a great career, and it was really interesting for me to take a break in between, go back to grad school with that type of experience, then come back into the sector where that previous experience has really helped me, but my work at UT was really important as well. So at the Oregon Department of Energy, our role as a department is to help Oregon move towards a safe, clean, affordable, and sustainable energy future. Oregon and our neighbors, Washington to the north, leading states in the transition to a clean energy economy. We've recently passed a 100% clean electricity standard, as has Washington. So it's a really exciting time to be in this field up in the Pacific Northwest. So as an agency, to sort of fulfill our mission, we have activities in kind of 5 general areas. We provide a central repository of energy data, information, and analysis for the state. And that helps with planning, regulation, program administration, and policy development. This next one's a really important one. We provide a venue for problem solving for Oregon's energy challenges. So we have convening powers to convene stakeholders, agencies, and others, and we aim to have really constructive conversations about Oregon's energy challenges and future, and do so in a way that considers a diverse range of perspectives and really fosters collaboration and innovative solutions to get there. We also provide energy education and technical assistance. So we provide educational resources to Oregonians broadly, as well as advice to legislators, the executive branch, local governments, industry, and other energy stakeholders. We provide regulation and oversight. So we manage siting of energy facilities in Oregon. We regulate transportation and disposal of radioactive materials. We administer the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is my job. And then we have a number of energy programs and activities. Energy efficiency programs, grant programs to support renewable energy development. We've got a really exciting grant program to look at to fund community renewable energy projects that have resilience benefits for local communities. Like many state agencies, we have a lot of different roles, from administration to program delivery, liaising with the legislature, etc. My team is the policy and innovation team. So we are sort of dedicated to keeping Oregon on the leading edge of renewable energy and energy efficiency work. In early career staff in my team we tend to start off as policy analysts or research analysts. They provide research support, do things like write up issue briefs, contribute to the agency's public-facing educational materials, assist with stakeholder engagement. And then over time, 5 years, could be sooner, in fact, just between 2 and 5 years, you work your way up to being subject matter experts, senior policy analysts, where you'll be called on to run research projects, provide expert testimony to the legislature, work extensively with experts and stakeholders in and out of the state to further state policy goals. And as I mentioned, that can happen quite quickly. In terms of what we look for in hiring, it's a broad range of skills and background. Obviously, on the educational side, looking at folks with degrees in public policy, environmental science, economics, engineering. You generally need some subject matter expertise or experience, between 1 to 3 years for an entry-level position on our team in energy policy or climate policy. In terms of what we look for in technical skills, experience with data handling and data analysis, using data visualization tools like Tableau or ArcGIS is useful for our team. Experience planning and implementing research projects. Critically, it's really important to be able to have very good verbal and written communication skills and a demonstrated ability to really communicate complex ideas to a wide range of people with different levels of technical expertise. In terms of getting strategies for applicants, the state agencies typically have a fairly formal process to follow in terms of actual hiring. But at our agency, I can speak to our agency, we're a very public-facing entity, so we're always open to speaking with early-stage professionals and providing informational interviews. So reach out to me, or if you'd like to learn more about that. And that's informational interviews I've found are always a good foot in the door, reaching out to your alumni network or through activities like this. Just ask people, just be bold, reach out, find out what people like talking about themselves. So doing informational interviews is a really great way to get a foot in the door. But I'll hand it back over to you, Eric.
Great. Thank you so much, John. So we are going to wrap up the virtual panel with two final visitors, both of whom are from New York. So I'll start with Kirsten Smith, who's joining us from Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Hi, Kirsten.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me here today. So my name is Kirsten Smith, and I'm a staff research associate at the Center on Global Energy Policy, which is part of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. We are housed within a university, but we're a nonprofit that focuses on delivering academic research to different types of decision makers, whether they're in governments and businesses and regulatory agencies. So one of the big goals of our organization is to make sure that the most up-to-date academic literature is in the hands of people that can actually use it to move us towards a more sustainable energy future. So on top of writing different types of research reports, which can include things like articles, media articles, and like the Wall Street Journal, different media organizations, we do longer research reports. We also bring people together for public and private workshop events where, again, we're getting people into a room to have a conversation around a bunch of different topics that we work on and really like come to actionable solutions as to how we get to a cleaner energy future. We have researcher groups across lots of different technologies. So personally, I work in the power sector research initiative. I also do work on the geopolitics of the energy transition, but we have a carbon management group. We have an energy systems modeling group. We also have regional focuses. So we have a Latin American region, a China studies group, and we're expanding into other areas like innovation and technology and energy for development and energy justice. So part of what someone at my level, I came into Columbia just under 2 years ago, straight out of grad school at UT. And something that I work on mostly is I support some of our senior research scholars who are the top of their career, kind of people that would be the equivalent to a full professor at a university in either contributing to their research or actually bringing my own research ideas to write different reports or talk to people and get the analysis out to the world. Part of that is project management. Part of it is actually getting into the data yourself, doing the research, writing different parts of reports. There's a large variety of things that we're working on, and there's always opportunities to jump on to different topics, even though you might not even be housed within that specific area. So as a power sector research associate, I work with people on our energy systems modeling team and other groups at CGEP regularly. Another part of what we do, again, on bringing people together for public and private workshops, I help to organize those, plan the logistics, set the agenda, reach out to people to invite them. We also convene people for a summit every May, and we participate in New York City Climate Week in September, where we host a lot of virtual and in-person events more increasingly. For skills, I think John covered it really well. The quantitative and qualitative research skills are really important. Some energy sector specific expertise is always great to have. Academically, we take people from all sorts of academic disciplines, whether it's engineering, science, policy, law. Part of what we want to do is really make sure that all of those parts of the conversation are brought together. So having those perspectives with people with different types of technical expertise is really helpful. Communication skills are always really important, being able to, again, explain really complex topics easily to people who might not have the same level of technical expertise, but are making decisions around our energy system, as well as getting really technical and publishing in academic journals. And then communicating and doing different public speaking engagements. I personally work on a couple of different podcasts that we produce at the Center on Global Energy Policy, media interviews, and just supporting the different members of our organization to make sure that we're getting the most up-to-date and relevant information out into the world. And I think that covers it. Back to you, Eric.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kirsten. Great to see you. So we are down to our last virtual panelist. Before I invite up Kartik Pilar from Nyserda, I'd like to ask the folks who are joining us for our in-person panel in the front of the room to go ahead and come down now. So Olivier, yeah, everybody, you can go up and we'll have Kartik join us in the interim. I want to mention we still do have folks joining viewing on YouTube. So please continue to feed in the questions. We'll hold the questions for this panel so we can get to our last virtual speaker and get to the in-person part. The last note I want to mention before Kartik speaks is we are doing the networking event at the end of the afternoon for the last hour. So stick around for that. And with that, Kartik, yeah, take us home. Tell us just a little bit about Nyserda, and then tell us what the folks in the early career roles do on the daily to end our panel here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Nyserda is a great organization. We're a state authority in New York, and our role is to really drive market changes in the energy sector. So if you're a utility ratepayer within the state of New York, you pay a small fee. I think it's like 1% of your utility bill. You pay a service benefits charge, and that goes to Nyserda to try to encourage clean energy actions throughout the state in the form of energy efficiency, renewable energy, energy storage, what have you. And Nyserda is really at the crux of implementing those programs. And so we do a little bit of everything. We have a transportation team that works on electric vehicles, both for consumer and commercial vehicles. We do work in the construction space for housing and larger commercial buildings. One of our projects involves the Empire State Building. We work with industrial facilities, manufacturing facilities, as well as farms, trying to encourage those business owners and managers to implement clean energy actions. So we're kind of all over the place, and it is a fairly large organization, as was mentioned earlier. I think we're maybe 400 or 500-ish people. I don't recall the exact number off the top of my head. And so, as far as the role of early career professionals at Nyserda, it's kind of nice in the sense that if you have a graduate degree, you're more or less going to start off as a project manager, and the role you play isn't that much different than those that have been around Nyserda for 10, 15 years. In the end, your job is to help develop the programs, figure out how best to spend the service benefit charges in order to implement change. You're responsible for procuring contractors to actually do the work. So we don't actually implement the programs themselves. We hire other contractors to implement the programs, and we're responsible for reporting out the successes or places for improvement. And so that's actually kind of where my job comes in. Most people within Nyserda work in one particular sector, whether that's transportation, construction, the industrial sector, the commercial sector, what have you. But I'm actually on the evaluation team, so I get a little bit of experience into all the different sectors. I work with multiple teams within Nyserda, so I particularly like that. And it wasn't really a space I was too aware of before I started at this position. So for those of you that haven't really looked into evaluation, I do recommend it as a jumping off point for early career professionals. I really do enjoy my experience there. And as far as the hiring aspect in advice for applicants, I will say normally within New York State, the rules are pretty strict around you have to do a civil service exam, and then agencies have to give the jobs to whoever scored the highest on the civil service exam. But as a as a public corporation, as an authority, Nyserda actually has a little more leeway. So I do recommend it, as others have, reach out to me, reach out to anyone you can find on LinkedIn. Informational interviews are really helpful for getting your foot in the door and getting your application noticed. Nyserda really hires people from all over the place. Just within my own team, there are a couple people with PhDs in physics. There's a guy with an MFA in theater. There's a PhD in psychology. We're all over the place. As long as you're passionate about clean energy and you can show that you're organized and that you have strong communication skills, I think there is a spot at Nyserda for strong candidates. I think that's all I have to say. Back to you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I just want to point out one last thing about Kartik Pilar before he leaves, which is that he has both a PhD and a postdoc in physics and now works in policy, which is like a super hip way to do it. So if you want to reproduce a model, like, he's a really good carbon copy. So anyway, thanks a million, Kartik, and thank you to everybody who joined the virtual panel. This is like a super special thing. There's a lot of viewers that tune in through the 45 minutes that y'all joined us. So thanks a lot, and we'll say goodbye to our online panel. Thanks, folks. All right, so I'll move Griffin over here and join these folks. So this in-person panel is comprised of folks who live in Austin, with one exception, which is Vivek Nath from Guidehouse. If you're in the energy space, especially if you work in the power sector or transportation, you know Guidehouse, formerly Navigate. So since he's visiting from out of town and it was up late last night, and I gave him the wrong address to keep him on his toes. Let's start with Vivek. I'm going to ask each of you to first introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about your organization. And then I do want to get into the question about what are folks in your organizations actually doing in those first 5 years? How, and this kind of, I want to cover that topic again, but I also want to get into like what makes it go well, right? What is the differentiator between people who come in and do good work and the people who come in and like really fly and move through your organizations quickly and get noticed for doing good work? I'm going to start with Vivek Nath.
Everyone, is on?
Yeah, it's on. Yeah.
So let's see. So what does Guidehouse do? So Guidehouse Consulting, it's a consulting company. It caters to a variety of clients, basically both in the public and private sector. So, and they engage as a company actually in a wide variety of areas. It's not just energy and environment related consulting, but also finance, healthcare, and a couple other dimensions. Since the focus here is on energy, I'm just going to focus on that division of Guidehouse. So even just for that bucket of work, which is an energy and environment, you have clients varying from, let's say, Department of Energy, Department of Labor, basically federal agencies. It's not just limited to the United States. We also work with governments in Europe, a couple Latin America as well. In the US, you have a wide variety of clients there. Apart from government agencies, there's, let's say, utilities. That's a good part of our work. We work a lot with North American utilities. And also increasingly other players, for example, automakers or folks who are implementing energy efficiency programs, groups like that. In terms of my role, so I'm an associate director there at Guidehouse, and essentially a good part of my work is in mobility, clean transportation, and clean energy. So essentially in my role, a good part of what I'm doing internally is sort of directing our modeling, analytics, and consulting efforts internally to better cater to our clients. And externally, essentially serving as a subject matter expert, and you can say a decision support or analyst, right? That's a good part of what we're doing. In terms of early career and what folks do, clean the ground as they join Guidehouse and how to sort of fly, as Eric said. So I think typically you would join the company as a consultant, and there are varying degrees of consultants, but you can sort of paint a spectrum of positions from a sort of beginner consultant level to what would be ultimately the partner of the company. And essentially what's changing over time as you grow through these roles is that initially you join, what you're trying to contribute to really heavily is growing the subject matter expertise, like contributing analytically, be able to also communicate about complex issues, be able to put yourself in the shoes of clients more and more, and sort of speak to their needs, right? So it's not just purely academic, not purely report writing. Big part of the consulting job at that point is that you are able to speak their language, right? Understand how they work. So that's a good bit of where typically in the beginning, like you're less familiar with the client side of things and how particularly they work, and more familiar, more interested, and also more valuable as someone who can do the research, the analysis, the writing, the communication, to sort of help address that need. In terms of what helps grow your career, I would say, as a consultant at that point, consulting can be, it sort of, I would say, varies a little depending on which space you're catering to. So some can be very active and dynamic and fast moving. So like what I work in with electric vehicles is, I would say, questions we had 4 years ago are quite different from questions we have now that we're trying to address. And some a little bit more dialed in and have longer life cycles for the projects. You have projects that can vary from literally 2 months to 3 to 5 years, right, depending on the client and the need. So in terms of growing though, overall, I would say biting into the subject matter and the analytics, analysis, like how you're thinking about a problem is always going to be a strong thing. That'll help you for sure. And secondly, it's to be able to sort of cater to varying parties at the same time. So it's both internal folks that are people are not maybe having their hands in the weeds of analysis, but are trying to answer tough questions for clients, and then be able to speak directly to the clients, right, on whatever it is that they're trying to solve. So the more you can sort of fulfill that gap, sort of fulfill multiple needs, both on a hard, let's say, quantitative, qualitative research side, analytical side, as well as speaking to different parties based on what they need. I think it really helps your path, actually.
Excellent. No, well done. So thank you so much. So I actually thought of another question, but I want to get to the other panelists since we're not here for 2 hours. But I want to come back to another question I want to throw in the mix as we, and you get to just roll these into your remarks. But what did you actually do in grad school? So one thing is I know what a couple of you did in grad school, and it was like slightly different like approach to how some graduate students did in grad school in terms of how you actually spend your time beyond coursework. So touch on that just a little bit since we're talking to grad students. So we just had somebody who works all over the US and Europe. So now I want to go to somebody who's super Texas. So Venkat, would you tell us next and give us a little bit of background? So Venkat with Ercot. Yeah, it's on.
So my name is Venkat Tirupati. I'm the director of Legal Market Solutions at Ercot. As Eric said, Electric Reliability Council of Texas. We are local, based in Austin. And Ercot is a non-profit, independent organization that is oversight by the Public Commission of Texas, as well as the Texas Legislature. And statutorily, we are obligated to, keep the grid reliable, run efficient markets, keep the transmission and distribution open access, as well as provide retail choices for consumers within Texas. It's about 800 employee organization. In terms of what I do, Grid and Market Solutions, specifically at Ercot, I work at the intersection of business and information technology. We develop a lot of solutions that the control room folks, both on the grid side as well as the market side, use. I'm part of the team that also provides 24/7 support to the control room operator. And Ercot, given the statutory responsibility that we have, actually has a broad breadth of work that happens within Ercot. You have grid operations, you have grid planning, you have commercial operations, which encompasses sort of the market operations, market analysis and design, credit and settlements. And on the IT side, we have quite a few people who are working to make sure that all the applications are working properly for the control room. So it's a pretty diverse skill set that you'll find at Ercot. A typical Ercot candidate that we will find is an engineer with electrical power systems. There are quite a few of us who sort of have bachelor's in electrical engineering, master's in electrical engineering, with emphasis on electric power systems. That's a typical engineer. But then there are quite a few other divisions within Ercot where we find finance folks, finance services folks, some economists, some mathematicians. Ercot has very tailored programs for entry-level, early career professionals. We call it engineer development program. And we also have quite a few internships every year, close to 25 internships every year within different groups. Engineer development program is a very formal program. We take about 6 to 9 candidates every year. We rotate them through different groups. We planning with operations, market operations, within my group, within market solutions. And after a year or a year and a half, they go through different modules, we give them exams and things like that. They graduate out of their program and then they pick which group they would really like to go.
And they get paid in the interim, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a, Ercot has realized that we really groom a lot of folks internally, and this is sort of our way of doing that. We typically go to a lot of universities to get candidates into the early development program. And there are quite a few longhorns there.
I actually have two quick questions for you. We can do this quickly though. So do you hire your interns?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon, right?
We have close to 25 interns every year.
Right, and did you hire some of them on? Yeah.
Yes. Within my group, we have 4 interns this summer.
Right. Okay. Great. And you guys they do a formal process. I know because I've seen people go through that process, the hiring process. So you can actually go to their website and they post them ahead of time, which is a super nice thing for grad students. Another question for you though. So you mentioned something that we don't see a lot, which is that like you guys invest a ton as an organization in actually bringing people in as interns. You have short internships, I think you have year-long internships, and then you have the engineering development program. But for an organization like Ercot, why do you need such a long lead time to actually develop those candidates with taking them from the hardcore engineering skill set, but then training them to be specifically Ercot power systems people? So what's the importance of spending all that capital and professional development time on people who are early career? That's special. So can you tell us just a little bit about that?
It's a great question, Eric. Running the grid is complex. And it does take time for folks to understand what they study in the classes versus the practical real-time implications of how the grid runs, how the market runs, and a small mistake can have real consequences.
Yeah.
And so we like to ensure that either in the training that we impart on the students who come out of the university, before we really give them real responsibility, we like to make sure that they understand the repercussions of what.
Right. And so I'll move on to somebody else, but I just want to point that out. It's such an interesting thing because it's actually really expensive to do that. So that's one thing that you don't appreciate always as like somebody in very early career, but you understand once you're 10 years on, like it's actually really expensive to try before you buy with employees. So when you see organizations like Ercot that spend a huge amount of capital every year to make sure that they're bringing really, really precisely trained people on, there's a reason they do that. And those are organizations that are going to be committed to the long-term success of their employees. Because literally by the time they start their first day after that, they've done these training, they're $500,000 in. We used to have these markers where we would, you'd have your year milestone when somebody had been with you a year, then you'd give them another like funny pat on the back and buy them a beer when it was like, now you've paid off how much it costs us to bring you in 2 or 3 years later. So it's a really serious thing, but that's also a really good like indicator that you're looking at a serious organization if you see them investing that much in early career professionals and wanting to keep them in-house for a really long time. So thank you so much for that. So now from Paris, Texas. No, I'm just kidding. No, definitely not from Paris, Texas. No, so Olivier, you're totally different. So we just heard from 2 super technical people, another super technical person, but now in an organization that does a really wide array of technical and non-technical and human kind of human research as well. So, and also we also heard from 2 people who are primarily power and transportation. Now Olivier also works power and in the energy space. So Olivier, can you tell us just a bit about yourself and your organization? Get into the combo.
Thank you, Eric. No, absolutely. So I'm Olivier Beaufils, as Eric mentioned, I'm French, so that's the joke. So I work for IHS Market, which, funny enough, just closed their merger with S&P Global today, Standard & Poor's. So we're becoming part of a bigger organization. It was already not that small. So as Eric mentioned, this is a large organization that does a lot of things, right? It does financial markets, financial indicators, transportation, and then has a very large energy division, in which I work. My role more specifically is being part of, I'm the director in the energy transition team for consulting. And so we work with organizations, typically large organizations, around either their strategy and the energy transition, the decarbonization space, transactions when they go through processes of sales or mergers, acquisitions of different businesses in the energy transition space. So, you can imagine hydrogen assets or hydrogen companies, power and renewables, transportation, anything you can think of really. And we also do kind of the bread and butter of IHS Market is a lot of market studies and market intelligence, right? So one thing to point out about a company like IHS is consulting, which is a job that's very similar to what you just described before. That's my job, but we're part of a very large research organization, right? So our force is that we rely very heavily on our network of experts and on research teams that are producing intelligence and data and selling that intelligence and data in the market about pretty much every segment of the energy value chain that you can think of.
Really? Who buys intelligence?
So that's a great question. So our clients typically, there's a lot of large Fortune 500 companies right? So all the large energy companies have subscriptions, not just to us, but to others, to competitors with McKinsey, etc. But you know, you can imagine your Shell, your BP, your Calpine, your pretty much across the energy sector. We also sell our subscription to financial players, so banks, right, and private investors, private equity funds, etc. And then governments as well, right? So we work a lot with governments, and they use kind of this third-party data to compare and contrast what they think the market is like with what the rest of the market is saying.
Got it. Got it. And tell us, so in like 30 seconds, so who are you? So you've hired a lot of people in your, yeah. So they're all hired over here.
I think
so,
I'm like at 4 or 5 at this point.
so who do you hire and what do they do?
So me personally, or not personally, but my team, right? So obviously this isn't personal. My team, we hire and consult, right? So when we hire graduate students on early careers in consulting roles, and so that's kind of what they described before, right? It's coming in, working on projects that can last. Actually, we do more shorter projects than VBEC, so sometimes it's 2-3 weeks, up to 6 months, a year, on various topics, whether it's transaction support or more strategy or market analysis. Those are big buckets. And so what these graduates do is they'll focus on quantitative analysis, building a model to back the analysis that we're doing, creating the presentation materials, and sort of an answer to the client questions, right? And obviously, consulting communicates a lot via PowerPoints. We don't do a whole lot of writing and the sort of more academic report writing that is more typical here. So it's a lot of modeling, analysis, and then communicating those results to clients.
Awesome. Great. So you said strategy, market analysis, and what was the third portfolio? Because I was like, that's a general.
It's transaction support. So essentially, you're working with banks and private equities on whatever asset they're trying to analyze.
Got it. Okay, awesome. So I want to hear from Shaheen. So Shaheen has a mic, so we don't have to hand her a mic. But Shaheen, tell us what's going on now. Shaheen has to talk to us a little bit prospectively because she's part of a startup that's based here in Austin, which just did something that we'd love to hear, which is it closed its funding round and now has to hire a ton of UT grads. So, but anyway, it is really exciting. It's with an entrepreneur who's a very, very well established and incredibly well liked, I would say, like entrepreneur in the energy space, who works closely with Shaheen. So this is an exciting and a different perspective. So Shaheen, tell us a little bit, and both, like, you can tell, I realize like you guys are a smaller team, so go ahead and you can tell us a little bit, kind of more perspectively here. Is it on?
I'm not sure.
Does it have a green light? There's like a little button you slide at the top. Nailed it.
Hey, everyone.
There you go.
So I represent Bodhi here in Austin, Texas. We are a customer experience company in the world of solar. We're a team of 7. We're very small, but yes, as Eric mentioned, we just closed our seed funding round, sorry, of $4 million. So really excited about that. Yes, super small team of 7. Our broader goal is to cultivate the bond between people and the energy that powers their lives. And so our direct customer is the solar company, but our end user is the actual person buying the residential PV system or battery or what have you. And so ultimately we want to be able to serve every single residential solar customer. So if you ever buy solar, we want you to enjoy our products and maintain that 25-year relationship with the solar company. And so our immediate need for hiring right now is software engineers. So if you dabble in code or you know anybody, or even if you do none of the above, feel free to talk to me about opportunities at Bodie.
I turned my mic off when I was trying to remember how they operate. Okay, thank you. I have more questions for you, but I want to get through letting everybody have a chance to speak. So we actually have Martin from Aurora. Aurora, I want you to do the same thing as everybody else, but I have one additional thing for you, which is like Aurora is new in Austin, but it's also hiring like crazy. So tell us why is Aurora here? And I want to know that part in addition to everything else.
Yeah, definitely. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. I'm Martin Anderson. I'm with Aurora Energy Research. You may guess from the accent that I'm not originally from Texas. I'm originally from the UK, and that's also where Aurora started. So we are a wholesale power market modeling company. A lot of what we do is looking at the next 20, 30 years, what's going to happen. And really, the company started in the UK back in 2013. It was actually started by a number of professors at the University of Oxford, who essentially saw there was a fundamental change coming through the energy transition. The major changes coming through the amount of renewables, the deployment of more battery storage, of electric vehicles, much smarter than that. And at the same time, a need for dispatchable generation. And essentially, the shift towards those fundamental changes in the market has been a much more complex way to approach the model. The models that we've used in the past, when we just have thermal assets on the system, weren't going to cut it when we can get. And that's really where Aurora started. Looking back at UK 2013. It was just when the capacity market UK was about to be announced as well, so that's really helped. Since 2013, we now cover most of Europe, pretty much all of the main European markets, and we've extended out to the US as well. And so we're in Austin, based in Austin, we're currently modeling the Ercot, PJM, and ClimateWorks markets. And we're in Austin because it's the center of Texas, where a number of great graduates are currently. And it's also where a number of companies are, a number of our clients. So going back to the US expansion as well, I suppose we conquered the European markets and really tick those off. And really the next market to look towards the US. In particular, Ercot, as it's going through a number of changes at the moment with storage, with solar coming through, a lot of interest from our clients. We work with a number of investors across the European markets, and they were asking us about our view on Ercot. And so we moved out to Austin to start developing that work. As you say, we're relatively new. We've been here since about June last year in Austin. Currently about 15 people in Austin, but we're growing rapidly. Looking to be about 40 people by the end of this year.
Wow.
We really focus on wholesale power markets. So obviously lots of growth, lots of opportunity. We really focus on wholesale power markets to go deep on those. So we have a number of experts, really lots of opportunity to really go deep on these different markets and to make sure we're modeling them accurately as well. We develop our own models, so we're not using external software, and that means that we can really model the nuances of each different market and make sure that we go into these markets that we're modeling.
So you've hired 15 people since you started 8 months ago, 9 months ago. That's just Austin, right? That's just the US.
Three of those are California.
Yeah, okay, well, so we'll say 12. Yeah, obviously, yeah, it's fine. So, but what are the folks who are in their first 1 to 5 years after grad school? So what are they doing on a daily basis? You're more than 5 years after grad school, I'm guessing. So what are you delegating to them, and what are when they're doing a good job? What are they doing on a daily basis, and what are they doing to stand out as a top performer?
Yeah, definitely. It's very much, as we're a new company, there's still a bit of fluidity. I suppose what people are doing. There's no clearly defined role saying this person is doing this. So that's one of the advantages of working in smaller groups like that. Essentially, the work that we do is part research and part consultancy. So similar to as well in terms of those broad areas. So from day to day, very much depends exactly what we're doing. But if we're doing a piece of research, we're developing our forecasting. We're working closely with the modelers based out of the UK to improve the modelling that we have. We may also be working for a client doing transaction support. So working closely with them and developing their models. At the same time, we do a lot of presentations, developing lots of reports, and communicating that back to our clients as well. So day to day, it's not a very good answer, but it really depends. It's a very good mix of what you're going to be doing day to day. But lots of variety.
Yeah, right. But there's if you notice, there's coordination, there's project management, and then there's also like a lot of document production, right? You know, it's expensive. Yes, you have these skills they drill into in grad school about writing perfectly, like writing really well. You can't. That's why they're not being like persnickety with the resume thing. It's like very hard to hire somebody with errors in their cover letter because you have to count on them every day to do the most expensive thing, which is to work on a PowerPoint for, you know, and bill a client. I used to bill clients like $10,000 just for the work on a PowerPoint. That's a hard feeling if you're like, yeah, it took a really long time to do that. So, but just to point out why the soft skills are so important because they are a huge cost driver when you're the employee, when you're the employer. So I just want to, you've heard that a few times. So I have a question that I'm going to ask the panel. I want to start with Vivek Nath, but then I also want to mention that we're now in the point where, please, if you have questions, just Kevin over here, give Kevin a nod and he'll be looking. So please start, he'll come up and get your question and bring you a mic. To Vivek, so we clearly heard that, like, at least for this panel, this isn't universally true for everybody in the energy space, energy, power, sustainability, but it is more common in this area that you do typically bring some sort of a technical skill set in engineering and science and math or statistics or something like that, along with other soft skill sets and communication skill sets, people management. So Vivek, can you give me a couple of really specific examples, even if you want to give us a pseudonym for somebody you work with, people that excel who have like in the non-technical areas, or what those non-technical things are, the ones that are valued, what do they actually look like in practice for you as somebody who is, you are a technical person who does both, but like the folks who are in their first 5 years, what does that look like?
So I can think of a few specific examples. So at least in the space I work in within consulting, there's a lot of scope for flexibility and things aren't necessarily always dialed in. So there's a lot of a benefit to not being someone who's let's say a button pusher. Right? You don't come in and just do the routine every day. Like there's actually a lot of benefit to learning, adapting, being flexible. And this applies on both the technical as well as the non-technical side, right? So I think in terms of examples I can think of, Eric, so consulting is also kind of a fast-moving space. It can be a fast-moving space, and so you're trying to address newer sectors and problems, you know, as you're going on through the journey. So there'll be always an opportunity, and I'm going to quote a couple examples here, where in Guidehouse, for example, within mobility, a lot of our initial work was around research, analysis, evaluation, that sort of essentially value what we're providing. However, something that we've started to explore recently and been getting into more is actually designing and implementing programs in this space. For example, smart charging infrastructure programs. Right? And so, as you can imagine, this is a new space. Now, to solve that problem, figure out how to do it, there's a lot of non-technical stuff that goes into that. One is trying to understand like how to put a team together from scratch, or trying to understand how we can start to approach this thing that's in chaos and start to structure it. There's a lot of also then having to work with different people and personalities, right? So some people might be very structured, regimented, people that need protocol written down completely from A to Z. Some others are a lot more okay with flexibility. And at that point, you're having to work with different types of people in order to build a cohesive team and go ahead and execute on something that has not been executed before, right? And I think I learned a lot from someone who was a director in my team, and she had actually led and coordinated programs at a previous company and come to our firm. And I was just very impressed with sort of a lot of the things that she brought to the table that were absolutely non-technical, not in the way that we consider technical, right? So it's almost an art at one point, I think, what she was doing, which was kind of coming into the day and based on the chaos of the day, or like where you are in that journey, what you sort of wrote on paper a month ago after you just crunched up, thrown down, and then start from scratch and bring sort of fresh eyes to the situation, and sort of see what you've learned through the process in terms of everybody, how to communicate to them. And a good bit of that was coming to clarity and trying to communicate with different team members to sort of get to a unified direction. A lot of that was, you know, I would say a good bit of soft skills, a lot of having to think a little outside the box and not purely be, let's say, an analyst who's a specialist in X, or, you know, things like that. So I learned a lot from her, and she's kind of a mentor to me right now in my career. So that's an example I could think of.
Awesome. And so anybody else on the panel want to talk about that? Things, people who are looked at as examples of bringing a lot of value to the teams, but from the non-technical side. So any other thoughts? It's a really valued skill set. No, I'm just kidding. I won't put you on the spot. You're the only dude that values it. No, I'm
I
kidding.
could double down, but since
It's, oh, I see.
kinda doing the same thing, it's the same
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
but-
Got it. It's pretty similar. So questions from the audience. Do we have any questions from the graduate students in the room? I saw them all taking notes on their phones, so I know they have some sort. I'm just kidding. Okay, so we do have a couple more minutes. We'll wrap up here at 30 after the hour. Let's see. So we already covered what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. So we did have a question that came in earlier on the prior panel that was about how to actually articulate a switch when you're moving from like a pure technical space into these higher level energy interdisciplinary roles where you're either talking about things that are at the high level of the market, like what Venkat's working on, or if you're talking to multiple people across the energy or power value chains. So how have you seen people like successfully make a switch? Can somebody take that question, making a switch from being kind of a person doing a one-dimensional job to somebody doing the interdisciplinary? Yeah, Olivia.
No, I think it's a great question, and it's quite important as well because in the consulting that we do, quantitative background is pretty essential, right? Most of the projects we do will need some sort of in-depth analysis and quants. But the most important thing, I think, to succeed in these types of jobs coming from a technical or even more generally an academic background is to understand sort of what's the level of analysis that I need to get to, and how do I prioritize the time I have and the budget I have, because that's a reality of the job we do, to answer the question that my client asks in the best possible way. And what I find typically in consultants that join, kind of junior consultants that just start, one of the most challenging things for them is not to actually answer the question, is to answer the question with the time we give them to answer the question. Tailor the analysis to what they have. And so there's obviously different techniques that they go through. One is sort of obviously the simplifications and the assumptions that needs to be made just to boil down the problem to a simpler question, the level of accuracy or granularity that we need for the specific question. But I would say that switch, importantly, from getting the answer right to getting it right enough.
Yeah.
Is a very tricky, I think, first step and very important.
That's a really good answer, and it's also something that I can concur with. Yeah, I've seen that a lot, and that's a difficult thing. And I see that coming from the precision to accuracy thing, right? Accuracy to precision. Any closing thoughts from any of the other panelists today? Otherwise, we can actually head to our networking hours as we wrap up.
I don't want to get in the way of drinks.
No.
I think just a few thoughts to me, just on for people looking to make these applications to really stand out. I think a few things to bear in mind for me. I think we all mentioned concept now is super important. So getting that experience now as part of your degree or outside of that, as part of a hackathon, can really help. And I think we all work in energy, and just showing that enthusiasm that you have for the energy sector really comes across as well. So do the reading, make sure that comes across.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Don't go through grad school without taking the stats classes and learning to code. That's gonna help. Yeah. Listen, you guys are great. We're really lucky to have so many people who are willing to come this afternoon and visit us online. I hope everybody stays for the refreshments and the networking hour. Now we'll go up to the courtyard for. And to everybody who joined us online, thank you so much. We got some of your questions in. I didn't get the last handful of them, but thank you so much for joining. And yeah, for those in the audience, would you join me in thanking our guests? Yeah. So did you guys get this? We could choose to meet each other. I guess not. Yeah, I know all. Right.